Are we ready? Yeah? Okay, hello again, everyone. Hello, hello. I'm going to ask you again, for the sake of myself, our panelists, and to recenter us in this conversation, if you can please join me in a few centering breaths. Exhale all that air out of your lungs. Inhale, fill up. Exhale, sigh it out. One more time, inhale, fill up. Exhale, sigh it out. So Megan walked us through a lot of concerning data, right? And it would be, I think, amiss if I didn't acknowledge the concerning data, but also the moment that we are experiencing, waiting for the Supreme Court decision to come down around affirmative action, and yet the tension of a celebratory weekend to remind us of what liberation must look like, right? So my hope today, after our panelist discussion and as you leave the University of Minnesota to your long weekend, is that you leave the space rejuvenated, connected, and also connected to this community and ready to act, right? It's a lot. It's a lot to take in, being a part of the group, continuing to look at the data. It's a lot. Race equity work is a lot. Advocacy is a lot. Speaking truth to power is a lot, right? The path towards justice and liberation can feel insurmountable, right? And yet, as I prepared for our time together, I had to think, I am here. A queer, trans, first generation, impoverished boy, to be able to host this panel today. We have reminders of liberation and what it must look like here today with us, right? And we can't lose that. So again, as a first-generation trans feminine person from the US-Mexico borderlands, it doesn't escape me. The power of us being here today, exploring policy work, and all that good stuff. I am so excited to serve as the guide for our conversation today. Our panelists represent a variety of unique perspectives in this work, and I am not going to take the time to introduce them all. Instead, I will say that we have perspectives at the Senate level, at the policy level, the research level, practitioners, scholars, dynamics, student, all of it. And the purpose of this conversation is to take those numbers and humanize them and add stories and context so that we don't just stay at the concerning numbers, right? That we hear from folks who are out in the field doing this work and making things happen. So I have invited our guests today to take the opportunity to introduce themselves and have also asked them to prepare about a 3-minute opening in response to our centering question, right? So here it is. I hope you're ready. So first off, panelists, please take some time to introduce yourself. Who are you? What experiences shape your perspective today? And from this place of experience, your personal experience, your professional experience, and positionality, please tell us, what is the state of Native and Indigenous students, students of color, and first-generation students in higher education today? Minerva?
Thank you, Fernie. My name is Minerva Muñoz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Dean for Institutional Equity at Macalester College. Prior to that, I got to serve for what I felt like was a gazillion years, but 17 years in TRIO programs. For 12 years, I got to direct 2 TRIO programs here at the University of Minnesota, the Upward Bound program, serving pre-college students, first-generation, low-income, local Minnesota students who also happen to be predominantly students of color because race and class are intertwined in this state. I myself am a first-generation college student, college graduate. I grew up in New York and Milwaukee on public assistance, housed in public housing, and educated in public schools. I spent my career working on educational equitable access and success outcomes for my community, who I define as and love on is low-income students, first-generation college students, students of color. My foundational experiences that I've lived and the love for my community has shaped where my passions have directed me and how I've approached this work. I will say that TRIO has been a really strong shaper of my identity. And even before I became part of TRIO as a professional, as a high school student, I participated in pre-college EOP programs that were designed from TRIO programs, publicly funded in Milwaukee, but also very much mimicking the TRIO way. And when I got to the University of Minnesota, while I wasn't a TRIO student, I found and was adopted by the TRIO program here. And I recognized and learned from there the importance of collective community and how having mentors, supports, people who were lighting the way and demonstrating what could be, how exposure to things I never knew existed were profoundly impactful in my development and where I would take my education. And when I first took the job as a TRIO Upward-Bound director, I think that's when it really dawned on me the sense of responsibility I had in educating students who were me for my community, and the intentionality that it really took. To not mimic, I think, the way that education can be reproduced in very toxic ways. My first endeavor, really, I had a summer program for 6 weeks, and we would hire about 20 to 25 instructors every year. And as we know, the instructional class of Minnesota is very white, very middle class, and TRIO programs aren't heavily funded. So we didn't get to pay high rates of what I believe and what I know my people of color who get degrees know that they deserve. Mm-hmm. So they weren't applying, right? And I was ending up having to hire a lot of people who didn't look like, experience life like, or understand the populations that I was serving. And we started really thinking about what does it mean to be a program that is not just thinking about training the students, but training the people who are serving the students, so that they also do no harm. So that in those 6 weeks, when they're there, their biases don't impact how the students see themselves in education, where they see themselves going in education, that the examples they're bringing to the information they're sharing is relevant and engaging for the population so that they can get motivated, so that they can feel passionate about this, so that they can see themselves in these spaces. TRIO also grounded me in the importance of bringing families along the way. I think that that's something that we often miss in higher education. First-generation college students have a lot of things that they will be experiencing that their families may or may not, and often not, understand fully. And it can feel really isolating for them as they're trying to achieve in a place that they've never been, and translate that to families who don't understand. So we really worked hard to try to bring the families along and help set their expectations as well. Fast forward now, I'm at a more privileged institution, serving students who are also first-gen, low-income, students of color who are trying to achieve in a prestigious liberal arts college. What I'm noticing from the pandemic and these populations across the board, so the TRIO students I served and the Macalester students I'm serving now, is that the pandemic has definitely impacted them in their ability, their experience, their practice in communicating across differences. I think the energy and fear that society has created about having an ignorant opinion about something is really daunting for the young population to engage and not be like doxxed or online bullied afterwards. I will say that I do notice that the need to be engaged in communication across differences was not something that just started from the pandemic. I remember in 2019 working with a cohort of first-year students who, that's when we bought conversation cards. Let's just, help this conversation go, because technology was already getting in the way. And while I see technology in all of its beauty and access of information, and I see a young student body, students of color, first gen, who know a lot more and have access to a lot more, the ability to grapple with it is not necessarily something that we're doing very intentionally in education. And I think the echo chambers, right? While they may have access to a lot of information, that students have very much these algorithms, the way that online information sharing happens is that they may know or have access to things, but they only know what's in their lane, right? They only know what that algorithm is putting in front of them. So how do we as educators help reshape where they're getting information from, how that information is getting to them, and how they critically think about it? So I don't know. I think the state of students of color, first-gen, indigenous students is all over the place. There's still eagerness, there's energy, there's motivation, there's confusion about the value of it. There's a lot of different messages that they're getting in the world. I mean, and there's the financial reality that they have to live now. And many of them are making, it's the marshmallow test, right? They're eating the marshmallow now and going into the workforce and becoming part of that economy without necessarily pursuing, what I believe is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? The self-actualization, the dreaming and achieving what they dreamed.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Carly.
It's my turn? Okay, all right. Ready? Is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Oh, wait, I lied. Sorry. But
right? Do you want to go?
Whoever.
You go.
Go ahead.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Ron Ferguson. I'm a sociology faculty member at Ridgewater College, and I also have the honor of being one of MnState's equity inclusion coordinators, where we as a team seek to really close those equity gaps, respond to them courageously, and I'm just so glad to be part of the team here in our system that's recognizing there's a lot of work to be done. And when I think about the state of where we are and our students, marginalized students, what the conditions are, I can't help but think back to my own lived experience. I am a first-generation college student. Growing up in the U.S. Virgin Islands, I had no idea what college was, and my trajectory was to help the family out, work at the sugarcane factory, and for some reason, some people said, hey, you should go to this thing called college. I had no idea what that was. Bachelor's degree, associate's, master's, I had no idea, had no understanding of the language, and said yes. And for many students, it can be a very subversive act, even to think about going to college. When I went to college and left my island, my brother dropped out of school to support the family. I was scared, had no idea where I was going. Actually, the glossy ads I got from North Dakota State University had kids hanging outside in canoes. I thought to Mom, this is just like the Virgin Islands. Well, it wasn't. Just to be clear. A little deceptive marketing there, right? It was like, I learned pretty quick. But not only that, but I also realized it was not like home for various other reasons. It wasn't just the weather. It was the way in which I was viewed, the way I was perceived. I felt like an absolute, not only outsider, but I felt like an imposter. That imposter syndrome for so many of our students is real, and I felt that. I'm like, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. On campus, every day, I just was like, I can't believe that I'm here. And so I think about that experience and how I then translated that into just sort of making it through and decided to give back and work as an educator and a scholar. In my research, focusing on looking at aspects of education and access, and again, one common denominator of all the research I've done is thinking about that whole student. What does success look like? And I'm going to talk about this later. Is bringing that whole student, that you don't have to leave part of yourself behind to be successful. And so many times I felt like I had to leave part of myself behind to be successful because it was incongruent with higher education. So I think about that, and I'll just say this: the state of higher education today, it is not hyperbolic to say it's a crisis. And I'm saying a crisis not because of the students, because we need to reject that deficit mindset. It's because of the systems and structures we built that really, in many ways, are having students feeling like they are in a boat without a paddle. I think about this reality as it came to me in my office one day. And, the data can say clearly, but I think about how a student came to my office, a student of color walked and sat down, and he said, Professor Ferguson, help me. I don't know what to do. I feel lost here, and I don't feel supported. Help me. And I looked at, he wasn't just looking about the assignment. He was thinking to get help. He was looking at, he needed help in our institutions, in our system. And I felt in many ways ill-equipped to respond to not only the need of what he needed academically in the classroom, but he needed beyond that. And seeing that broke my heart. And I mean, this student was crying in front of me and recognizing that this case all too often is what's happening in all of our institutions. And if you're not seeing that, let me tell you, it's happening. There are students right now in our system wondering, should I even go back in the fall? Is this even for me? And see, that's a sense of urgency we need in our system. I can't sit stoically and just be like, you know, I'll look at the information and I think we need to do some things. We need to look at it with desperation, as we don't want to lose another student. We can't lose another student. And so my passion is only driven by the fact that if we don't act together collectively, because it isn't just about the panel or one person or you, or it's going to take us collectively. If we're not doing that, we're going to see significantly more outcomes that are going to make us just more upset and more frustrated and hopefully not lead to apathy and despair. So it is with that, I think the state is to recognize the problems we have in front of us are affecting the lives of students, and that we need to come together. And again, I'm going to talk more about that, but we need to come together courageously. And coming together courageously isn't always comfortable. But we'll talk about that later. So I get fired up because I can't help it. How can you help it when you think about the students? I think about a student in front of me and what my responsibility is to tell his story. And that's the state of where we are in higher ed in Minnesota.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you. All right, Carly, this time for real.
Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Duran-Marrero. I use she, they pronouns. I am currently the director of the Emerge Summer STEM program that lives in the President's Emerging Scholars program in the Office of Undergraduate Education. And so this is my first professional full-time role. I just recently graduated with my master's in higher education here from the University of Minnesota. I also was an undergrad here and graduated in 2020. Additionally, this last academic year, I served as the Living Learning Community Advisor for CASA the year prior for the First Gen LLC. And so I'm very familiar, very tuned into what it means for our students to be coming to this institution specifically, and I won't pretend to know what exists in other roles in other institutions, but this institution specifically, it is urgent. I will echo that. I think often about my first-gen experience as an undergrad, but then also as a graduate student. What does that mean? Both of my parents work in manual labor fields. The grandparents that I do know were educated in Cuba, and so education was a value, but it was a free value, right? So what does that mean as it gets passed down onto me? Similarly, I think often about Latinidad and the racial complexities of what it means to be Latina, Latino, Latinx, Latine, right? And how we encompass so much diversity and how can we think collectively in those ways. Another student experience that I think really encompasses the urgency, the passion, the possibility, the excitement that I really like to focus on is one of basic needs. A student that I got to know in this last academic year, she is brilliant. She is truly, and we know these students, they all are so brilliant, truly capable, resilient, fierce, caretakers, caregivers, all these things, right? So this student is working full-time, working from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning, doing, what's it called? Like manufacturing, like assembly line, right? And I know this, the institution that they work for, no ethics, right? All these things that are larger systems I have no control of. But I do have control of what her day looks like. And so she wants to be able to sleep from 6:30 to 2 p.m., but all the classes she wants to take in her engineering degree are in the mornings because she has to go to a lab and so on and so forth, right? This student also emptied all of the $6,000 of her savings that she earned during her high school years to help her family buy a home, right? This is the state of our students. And this feels like a particular student, but she is not the only one that I know, right? The students that we serve are hungry, they are houseless, and they are commuters. And I've also often thought about this institution specifically as a small city, right? As a city, as an ecosystem. And so that means that all of us have a voice in this democratic way. And so if we give our students that same voice, I have immense amounts of hope, right? The language we can give our students, the urgency, the aiding in the empowerment, right? All those bits. I think we need basic needs. That's my focus personally at this point in my career. And I thought it was going to be something like STEM advancement, or something that feels distant. But our students are hungry. Our students are not sleeping. I was one of those students just 3 years ago, right? And so to know that that exists still in the ones that I care about, truly love from a distance, strangers to me, what does that mean? That we're hungry, and their parents are hungry, and their siblings are hungry, and our friends are hungry. What does that mean, right? So this is the urgency I try to move with. I'm eager to know what you all do in the world, and I'm new to the field, and I'm trying not to get jaded and all these things, right? But I'm thankful to be here in community with you all, and I know our students are thankful to come in contact with folks like us. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Olson.
Bonjour, Guinois. Bonjour, Anishinaabe. Dennis Olson, in Indigenous, Jaganashimung, Dash Bidaban Indigo, Gajuanang and Dunjaba, Makundo Dame. Good morning, everybody. Dennis Olson. I serve as the Commissioner of the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. I introduce myself in the Ojibwe language. To let you all know, I'm also an enrolled citizen of the Fond du Lac, Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, one of our 11 tribal nations here in Minnesota. Yeah, go Fond du Lac. I'm trying to sit up straight. I wore this shirt thinking we'd be behind a table.
Same.
Yeah. Like, if I let it go, I'm going to send a couple buttons flowing. Yeah. So anyway, I'm also day 2 in new bifocals, so it looks like I can see. I can't see. I'm learning. I've spent my young 23-ish year career in education, more specifically working with and on behalf of American Indian students, not only in the state but nationwide, and that's really an honor and a privilege, but more importantly, a responsibility I take really seriously. I've been put in certain roles to work with our communities, work with Native students, work on behalf of the wishes of our elders, the dreams of the visions of our elders, on behalf of elected tribal leaders and on behalf of our tribal nations. And I'm fortunate to be able to do that still in this role, serving as Commissioner of the Office of Higher Education. I've mentioned, working for 23 years. I was here at this institution working with Native students for about 10 years and started my career there. And specifically those programs that I worked with were looking at Native students' transition to life after high school, right? What does that mean for them, whether that's college or career opportunities, going right to work, whether it's looking at military as an option. Absolutely love that. It was all about, leadership, self-advocacy. I was appointed after leading the education department at the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. I was appointed by former Commissioner of Education, some of you probably know her, Dr. Brenda Casilius, appointed as the State Indian Education Director at the Department of Education. And some of you have heard this story, but it was literally my first week on the job in 2012. The national on-time graduation rates, 4-year graduation rates came out. And I printed that report off. It was kind of one of the first things I did. I wanted to kind of see where we were at. I was grounding myself, even though I had a really good idea of where we were at in Minnesota. So I printed off 5 pages, flipping through the states, looking at students of color, but specifically looking at Native students, and I flipped, and I flipped, and I flipped, and I got to the back page of that report from the U.S. Department of Education. I finally found Minnesota, 50, I thought of 50 in the nation for graduating Native students. At the time, we were at 41, 42%, 4-year graduation. And that comes to my mind every time I see the attainment data, like Megan shared this morning, right? Showing that, of our statewide 70% attainment goal, educational attainment goal for higher education, Native students started in 2015 at 21%. And half of those credentials were at a certificate level. Now, we've made incremental change. We've made change over the years of a percentage point or 2 maybe, right? We recently saw graduation rates released from the Department of Education. Native students are up 10 points. That's a huge jump, right? It's still urgent. It's still a crisis, an absolute crisis. And so, you know, I focus on and gravitate towards the data around Native students. But, I mean, you saw the data. That's the state of higher education for students of color and American Indian students in Minnesota today. A lot of amazing things have happened, you know, in the last decade that I've worked for state government. We're not moving quick enough or with enough urgency, right? And folks kind of question why I'm so passionate or why I'm so vocal about these type of things. You saw it. We saw it. We're going to continue to see it today. It's in those reports. It's on my website, right? But I try to think every day about what visions Native communities and tribal nations had and have and will have for their students going forward. And that's what I carry in my daily work. And so, you know, the state of higher education today is what it is. You saw it. And so it's our job right here to, you know, really step on the gas here in this room today and going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Sam.
Thanks, Fernie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Parmekar. I am the committee administrator for the Minnesota Senate Higher Education Committee and its chair, Omar Fateh. So in that position, I work with the chair and members of the committee on setting the policy agenda for what we do at the legislature. This past session, we worked on setting the state budget, but also part of my role is making sure that we are holding public committee hearings and we're bringing in members of the public and actually many of the people in this room to come and testify and tell us about what we're talking about today, which is the state of higher education. Before serving in this role, I was a student here at the University of Minnesota, and I was really lucky to get to spend 2 years working as a legislative advocate for students at the state capitol. And this was a volunteer role, but I still like to tell people I was the lowest paid lobbyist at the legislature. But that was a really meaningful experience to me, and I spent most of my time advocating for legislation to help improve student access to basic need supports. And Carly mentioned more in depth about kind of the urgent need for that right now. But it was really that experience as a student advocate that kind of led me to the role I'm in today. I didn't really care about higher education policy at all as a student, but just getting to work with a lot of my peers on campus and then going to the legislature and seeing how a lot of those stories and a lot of those realities weren't represented, particularly by a legislative body that's full of a lot of people that haven't been in college for 20, 30, 40 years. That really informs the work that I do today. And so one of the things I'm really passionate about at the Senate is making sure that we are hearing directly from students who are the subject matter experts in higher education. And so I'm really grateful this session that we were able to have a lot of students come down to the Capitol and testify and work with us on legislation. I think in terms of the state of higher education for students of color, Indigenous students, and first-generation students, I'm really glad that Megan kind of shared some of that information about attainment rates in Minnesota specifically. And just to go back to that, we have an attainment goal of 70% of Minnesotans aged 25 to 44 attaining a higher education credential. And for white students, that rate right now is 68%, but it's 38% for Black Minnesotans and less than 30% for Indigenous and Latino Minnesotans. And it's not just attainment, it's also retention rates. So we know that for students of color, first-generation students, they're a lot more likely to drop out or not complete a degree. It's also persistent in rates of basic need insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity. We know students of color, Indigenous students, and first-generation students are a lot more likely to struggle with that. And that data is really important, but I think more important is the actual stories that we hear from students, and the students that would come to our committee and tell us about the third job they had to pick up in order to afford tuition and textbooks, and they're still going to graduate with a massive debt burden. Or the student who doesn't have affordable and accessible childcare options while they're trying to pursue a degree, and so they've had to put their learning on pause. And this was my first year as a committee administrator. Senator Fate, it's his first year as chair. So for us, it was a lot of kind of building the plane as we were flying it. And I'm really grateful to the commissioner and a lot of the folks in this room for educating us on some of this data and the really dire state of equity in higher education. So I think the data and those stories tell us that our current higher education system isn't supporting students of color, Indigenous students, and first-generation students in the way that it supports white students. And that is, of course, because higher education systems were built for a particular kind of student. And I have a quick story that I think really exemplifies that concept. A couple of years ago, one of the first advocacy initiatives I worked on was trying to expand free transit access here at the University of Minnesota. Those of you who have gone here or work here probably know that the university exists in a food desert. There is not really an affordable, accessible grocery option within walking or free transit distance for most students. And so if you don't have a car, getting healthy groceries, getting affordable groceries is actually pretty difficult. And so one thing we were trying to do is expand the free transit access pass for students so they could at least get to a grocery store that wasn't the CVS. I was testifying at the legislature about this, and one of the members of the committee asked me, she said, well, if students run out of groceries, why can't they just, call their parents and have them pick them up and go grocery shopping? And that was just, I think, a really startling thing to hear, but I think it makes sense that you might hear that from a legislator, because I think there's this really prevalent mindset of a specific archetype of a college student, which is a white student who's enrolled in a 4-year degree right out of high school, parents in the suburbs who are well off enough to support them financially throughout college. And students who don't fit that really specific archetype aren't necessarily seen in the lens of policymakers, and we don't make policy to support all of those students. And so as we have this conversation today, I think recognizing that the state of equity in higher education is not just that students of color, Indigenous students, and first-generation students aren't supported by current higher education systems, but that they're oftentimes not seen and their needs aren't seen. And so there's obviously a lot of work we still have to do, and I'm really grateful for the work that everyone in this room does to try to educate decision makers about those students and those stories, because I think if we're ever going to create a system that supports all students fully, we have to have an understanding of the challenges that all students face.
Okay, so there's a lot here, and I'm not going to try to summarize everything, but I do want to invite us all, if something came up for you as you were responding or hearing another panelist's response, some of the key words were family, right? It isn't just about the student, it's about the family and the community. I saw the whole student being centered in your conversations, the urgency, right? So what came up for you that you want to contribute further or expand on as you were hearing the intros of all of our panelists today? No order. There's no order. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think something that I find really powerful, I was also President's Emerging Scholar as an undergrad, and so now it's like very full circle, right? But I had the pleasure of being at the retirement party of the founding director of the President's Emerging Scholars program, and I had to tell him that I feel like you raised me. I believe that through and through. I feel like you raised me right? And so I know there's a lot of, discourse around student affairs, faculty, all the things, right? The things that I'm like, I don't care. Like, let's just support the students, right? But I think the reality is that we have to expand our understanding of what our niche is. I think our ideas of what one skill set is and the siloing of the university doesn't serve that kind of holistic approach for our students. And then we have a more actual concept of what the urgency really is that we're speaking of. So I think engaging the family, understanding who the family is, inviting families into our spaces and going to meet them, like, imagine if we were able to break from the concepts of whiteness, of individualism, of autonomy in these very rigid ways, right? I think I like to imagine what that kind of family network looks like in the institution. Yeah, those are just a little bit.
Can I piggyback on that?
I'll make sure it's on.
All right, so no, that is so spot on with what I wanted to say with regard to, think about equity, right? We oftentimes, and many of us know, people sort of confuse equity and equality, and I think about this idea of equity is not about treatment, it's about outcomes. And so many times when we think of equity as an outcome, we do focus on some of the very important data points. For example, things such as graduation rates or achievement in some level, and those things are super important and actually very paramount to what we're trying to talk about here, but it isn't existing in a vacuum. We need to expand, in my mind, and I'm hearing you all talk about expanding this idea of what does it mean to have equity in so many different places. I'll give you an example of a student who graduated recently who was a successful student of color, got the degree, and it was on graduation day, and I asked him, so how do you feel? You graduated, you got your bachelor's, this is exciting. He said, I stinking hated it. I survived it, I couldn't stand it, and I can't wait to get the heck out of here. I don't want to see education anymore. You know, that would be seen as a win in some of our metrics, but that student left our experience in higher ed feeling completely as an outsider, feeling completely like they didn't belong, and what message does that send to generations, to family members, et cetera? And so I think about equity in terms of all aspects of the experience in higher education, right? Not just the fact that you survived through it to the end, but how you were able to bring your whole self to be accepted, to be loved in these spaces. And so that might be a tall order, but we have to try to achieve that. You know, to think about equity broadly, I'm so thankful for my colleagues in Minnesota State as we think about developing equity scorecards to look at multidimensional sort of aspects and indicators of what are we doing to be successful. If we're driving towards what we call the State Equity 2030, what are we doing in our institutions and systemic? Now, I'm a sociologist, so I think about structures and systems and how that plays a part for students. Like, what are we doing structurally to make sure that we're allowing for that equity? One thing that I encourage us to think about is, this idea of, in many of our K-12 partners, you might have heard of it, equity walks, right? Mm-hmm. What does a walk to the bookstore look like? What does residence hall? What does an experience of your move-in day look like? What are we doing in our equity walks to know what is the experience? If we're really wanting to center belonging and reject this notion of otherness, how are we ensuring that students feel this way? That we know that the idea of a sense of belonging is not just sort of mutually exclusive, it's connected to other areas of equity. If I feel like I belong here, right, if I see myself in the classroom, look, from my bachelor's degree to my Ph.D., I had no faculty of color ever. Ever, not one. All the way through my Ph.D., I had a guest speaker once, and that was a game changer. A guest speaker came to my class. He was from St. Vincent, and he was from the islands, and I said, can I stay after class and talk with you? Because to me, it was so profound to have someone that shared a bit of my lived experience that was sitting in front of a classroom. That little thing made a change for me. We need to make sure that that sense of sort of that seeing ourselves there is something that isn't to chance of a guest speaker, but it's at all our institutions. So to me, the takeaway is that we think about this idea of expanding equity as looking at what are the ways that we're seeing all the aspects of belonging that come into play here, right? Whether it's on campus or even in town. You know, the idea of, I think about Claude Steele was whistling Vivaldi. Many of my students have to wear their gear off campus. my students of color, because they feel unsafe without it. And what is our responsibility to ensure both on and off campus that our students feel they belong? It's not just, well, we do it on campus and what happens off campus. No, we do it everywhere. So that expanding equity to me in all those spaces is a key component to go with.
Thank you. I would like to expand a little too on that. One, I think that we're not talking enough about those educational experiences within, right? So I think about the number of students that I served who wanted to come to this institution to get a degree in engineering, or to get a degree from the Carlson School of Management, and they get an access point that's not necessarily conducive to them making it to that degree field, right? And so they leave communally and they go to their communities and they say, this degree is worth shit because it didn't get me where I wanted to be. And then that message gets passed on to their siblings and gets passed on into the community, and they say, well, I know somebody who graduated from the U of M and they're not doing what they want to do, right? So our social responsibility to help students get to where they want to be and make those pathways possible, I think is really important. The other thing I wanted to say, and I think as I was thinking about some of the data and things that we talk about, is that we're not talking about disaggregated data enough, right? In those numbers of all students of color, my experience is that men of color are really far behind in these spaces, right? So if we break this down even further, we're further leaving behind slices of our populations that need to be brought to the fold to have robust and vibrant communities. I see oftentimes that, the four-year degree becomes less and less of an attainable degree path for men of color who are oftentimes in their minds, and I don't know if it's society, socialization, we got the sociologist here so he could chime in. But they want these degrees like computer science and engineering and all these things, right? But the other reality is that white niceness is pervasive in Minnesota public education and K through 12, right? And so they may not have been challenged in the way that they needed to. They may not have been exposed to the level of institutional rigor that many of these elitist institutions are promoting. And so then they get here and the culture shock is so vast, so real. That sense of belonging may never be attainable, right? Because they're also not seeing a lot of other men of color in the fields that they want to go into. The places of STEM are still predominantly white, right? And so we're not doing the jobs of creating an educational space that mimics or looks like them, and then the sense of belonging becomes even more dire. And then the reality is that the wages are rising. The marshmallow test is real. They're gonna go and get a job for $19, $20, and in their 18-year-old, 19-year-old minds, this is gonna be making it. And many of them in their community, that is making it, right? But that wasn't what they originally wanted. So how do we help them get to what they originally wanted, to stay true to their core? And I don't think that these institutions currently are set up for that to happen. The way that we've really structured education to not have room for creativity. And I would also say, as we also have public officials in the space, is that I think that the public divestment from education is one of the biggest issues we're facing. Is there's no money in it. Rising costs, it becomes about capitalism. Higher educations are more operating like businesses. Students don't know that they're customers, right? And we're not teaching them to be good customers in this, to demand good service, because we still think education is a public good. But that's not what that's not what the federal government is setting up anymore. And that's the reality.
Sounds like an opportunity for Commissioner Olson and Sam to chime in here. Let's go there, this divestment that Minerva identifies, right? Say more.
Not much more to say other than that's right. I mean, that's absolutely right. That was a key theme of this current legislative session that just wrapped. It was a key theme of the last 4 that I've been intimately involved in. Sam's the real deal in not only advocating on behalf of students, but then coming to the legislature and telling that story on a larger statewide policy scale. This year was really the first year I was excited about potentially righting the ship a little bit. I mean, we had $650 million invested into higher education. and a commitment for $450 million into what they call the tails, right? The next biennial budget. Of course, when we get there, who knows what could be potentially on tap, but $650 million is a historic record-breaking investment. Not even close to enough. It's not even close to enough. Students will still experience, in some institutions, tuition increases, still experience significant pressures on housing and food insecurity, other basic needs, right? Like, we're setting the table. We were able to do that this year. It's incredible, right? Buy back a couple of years maybe of that disinvestment, but this has been going on for decades. Yeah. I mean, it really has. This doesn't fix anything. It starts to provide some opportunities. I hope we're just getting started. I really do. We need to continue on this path for many years to come.
Okay, there we go. No, you're absolutely correct, Minerva. If any of you come visit me at my office, which I welcome you to do, there's a big chart I have on a bulletin board, which is a graph of higher education spending as a percentage of the state budget over the past 20 years. And in 2001, higher education comprised close to 12% of the total state budget. Right now, it's a little under 6%. That's a massive disinvestment. And we actually have written into state law that says it is the intent of the legislature to provide for 2/3 of the cost of public education. Now, we have not actually accomplished that in a really long time. And Commissioner Olson's absolutely right. We had a record investment in higher education this year, $650 million compared to previous years where that's been closer to $100 million. That's a really big deal, but it's still not anywhere close to enough. We see we were able to fund a 2-year tuition freeze at Minnesota State colleges and universities, but the University of Minnesota is still increasing their tuition even with the increased investment. And even with that larger investment in Minnesota State and that ability to freeze tuition, they're still having to make cuts. And I think, Minerva, you mentioned earlier conceptualizing higher education as a public good, but we don't really treat it like one. And that's something I really wish and I hope that we as a state get back to thinking about, because we do think about higher education as a business a lot, and we think about profits and losses, and we don't think about it enough as a service and as an investment. I know part of Megan's presentation was talking about the workforce challenges that we see in our state, and obviously, I think to us in this room, that's not really the primary purpose of higher education, but a lot of people who are appropriating money think about that as kind of the return on investment for higher education. And it was there was this incongruence to me this session when we were, advocating for a larger investment in higher education than we got, that we heard a lot from state leaders about kind of the workforce cliffs that we're approaching in careers like teaching and nursing and construction. And we heard a lot of kind of like we're at a crisis point here, and we don't have enough people in our state to do these jobs. But that wasn't really reflected with kind of a requisite investment in higher education, recognizing that is the pathway to not just educate people to get those jobs, but to attract them to our state and to get them to stay here. Another thing we talk a lot about is Minnesota's population loss, Minnesotans moving to other states, and we heard a lot this year about how it was seniors who were taxed too much on their Social Security going down to Florida, but if you actually look at the data, it is predominantly young people who are enrolled in college that are leaving our state and they're not coming back because we don't invest enough in higher education. We don't give enough of those students a reason to stay here. So I think, big picture as we think about the future of our state and making this a place that's a great place for everyone to live and to grow up, that really starts with funding education and funding higher education and treating it like a public good again.
Thank you. Okay, y'all. I'm going to check in. Any further comments that you want to expand on before I switch us directions?
I still have all my buttons on my shirt.
Let's do it. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. I want to revisit one of the topics that Minerva brought up regarding the pandemic and everything that we have experienced and seen in the aftermath. And for the record, when I say the pandemic, when I say 2020, I'm not just talking about the pandemic. I'm talking about everything that came with it. So since the COVID pandemic has officially ended, right, we have witnessed, right, many commitments across higher education, nationally, and in this state, and I would say even at this institution, roll back some of the commitments that we have seen, right, institutions make broadly to race equity work. My question to you is, what do we still not know about the lasting impact of the pandemic and the ongoing racial reckoning of our society, right? What have you observed in this aftermath that has surprised you and that you want to highlight today? Carly, you're up.
Yeah. Hi, okay. Context. So I graduated the spring of 2020. So I graduated a semester, well, I was early, regardless. Doesn't matter. I was in a leadership class during the murder of George Floyd. While we were online during Zoom, we were making active decisions in community about whether we were going to go protest, inform family, bring groceries to family, communities, if we were going to go clean up, if we were going to go make a mess. All of these kinds of things, right, were active decisions that I was making as an undergrad. The pandemic lit fires. It also created a charge in my own self that education is a path, it is not the only path, right? And I think as educators, we often were like, this is the only way to do this kind of organizing, and I don't believe that's true anymore, right? So I think this institution specifically, regrettably, I think did injustice and commits to it every day, and I'll stand by that personally, right? But I do think that there are active folks doing good work. In terms of our ability as students, and I still feel like a student, I'm always a student, but as our ability as students to stay on track, to reckon with, do I submit this Wednesday assignment or do I go show up for my community? I don't know, right? Like, what are the social pieces that we're talking about? Saying something ignorant and being exiled from a community, that these are all social pressures that I don't think we're giving enough attention in tandem with the type of curriculum we're expecting our students to do. So I think of, some of our more rigorous departments. We know that there are racial disparities in our high schools, in our middle schools, in our elementary, et cetera. We know that, and then we also expect them to have a college-level understanding of chemistry. When I met chemistry teachers the last 5 years, and they're like, there's no chance I'm teaching these kids chemistry. Like, they're forfeiting because they're exhausted too, right? And so I think the reality of our students' ability to learn, the instructors, our expectations of them coming in, while also holding social exhaustion, trauma, impoverishment like we have not seen before, mass grief, like the list goes on, and the reckoning has not yet occurred. It just, I'm waiting for another shoe to drop, and I hope to find more organizers in the process, I guess is my comment. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Olson.
Couple things. It's a big question. I think to the tail end of the question there, lasting impacts, mental health. I think that's probably obvious to all of us in the room that our students work with students, work on behalf of students. This has been a fairly new conversation at a policy level. Really, is to provide adequate resources again, as part of the disinvestment. This has been one that hasn't been prioritized enough, but is one that comes up number one from students that come to the legislature advocating for additional resources for higher ed. This is also a fairly new conversation, I think, for higher ed within the last couple of years. Not only having to provide, academic rigor and preparation, but really addressing the needs of the whole student, right? I mean, that came up earlier. Students are asking for resources from their higher ed institutions, and so we have to continue to prioritize that and stand that up as a real need, certainly now as we recover from impacts of the pandemic, but going forward. I mean, it's an absolute, just basic student need, I believe, and I feel like we all believe that. Secondly, in terms of pieces that are being pulled back, commitments that are being pulled back, I think as Sam and I and all of us really alluded to a little bit ago here, I mean, Minnesota really stepped up. We really stepped up this time, and I think when we see others pulling back, I'm happy to say that we'll step up, we'll step in. I was just in Madison on Monday and Tuesday at a regional conference with Midwest states, and I felt like all eyes from the Midwest were on me on what's up with Minnesota. Some good questions, but I felt like a lot of critical eyes as well. I come home and open up a couple of higher ed publications I keep an eye on and see that the legislators from Wisconsin I was sitting next to on Monday and Tuesday were debating Tuesday night and into Wednesday about pulling $32 million out of DEI programs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. $32 million. And it's kind of a play, right? Not necessarily we're going to disinvest from DEI programs, but we're going to strip those resources and make you try to fill in the gap elsewhere. So other student services suffer, or other academic programs suffer, other faculty suffer as a result, right? I mean, I wouldn't have made it at this institution here at the University of Minnesota if I hadn't, during my tour, taken a left off the sidewalk and walked into Fraser Hall and went and met the folks at the American Indian Learning Resource Center. I really wouldn't, now coin. Had I not had the support from folks in the basement of Scott Hall and the American Indian Studies program, I wouldn't have made it here, right? And so that is how important those programs and resources are on our campuses. The Native Student Resource Centers or other student resource centers, right? The faculty that look like you and understand you and have the lived experiences of you and staff. That's what's important. You want to pull that away? And you think we're gonna be successful? I mean, that's literally the only reason why I made it here, because I found a community. And so in those aspects, I look at like the nationwide policy landscape of what's going on. Sam talked about our students are leaving. I hope they see investments like this and commitments like this that we're stepping up to, and they come back. Whether they're done with school and they want to come back here and raise a family, because this is a great place to raise a family, I think we need to start celebrating that. And so I'm really excited that we stepped up this session. I mean, you saw the Native student data, the attainment data. As part of the investment, we now have the Native student tuition waiver at all of our public institutions in the state. I mean, that's what it's going to take. You heard Rev talk about, a land acknowledgement. Whenever I'm asked to do a land acknowledgement, it's 10 seconds of recognizing whose land we're on, the original inhabitants of this land, and it's 5 minutes of a call to action, right? Putting your money where your mouth is. This is that call to action. These are the pieces, the things we were able to do this session, investing in student parents. Last night, my co-pilot, Nikki Oliver, invited me to a program at the Jeremiah program. Hi, Nikki. And you could see the results of investing in single moms, right? In their higher education journey, what that meant. What a celebration to be at. I mean, I went home, felt so energized, told my wife about it for like a half hour. Tacos were amazing, by the way, but like the investments matter. We're investing in student parents and student basic needs, in financial aid programs that make a difference for students, in college prep programs, right? Letting them know what's possible. All these things we're able to do this session, and again, I'll reiterate my point. We need to continue on this path. This can't be a one-time thing, cheerlead for ourselves. This is only the start.
Awesome. Thank you. Minerva.
Thank you. Okay, so, I don't know, I'm pivoting from what I originally wrote.
Take some more time.
I think the things that stand out to me as I hear some of the experts in this panel, and as I think about this more deeply, is that one of the things we did was demonstrate that we can act really fast in crisis during the pandemic. We can make big systemic changes. We can we can take all these policies that we said were rigid before, and we can change them to meet the needs, right? And there were so many people of color watching that, participating in that, students who bore witness to that, that when we went back to a really rigid system, they were like,
Yep.
right?
You showed them what's possible.
We showed them that we can
what
when
is
we
possible.
define things as crisis, right? What we get to determine is the important thing of the day. And so I remember I was doing an audit at St. Olaf College and talking with some of the students about some of the educational things that were happening there. And that was the resounding note that they said is, this is a crisis. You have to treat this as a crisis, administrators, like you did the pandemic. You showed us you can, right? And so I think that there's a mass of people out there calling BS right now on systems that act like they can only be one way. I think the other thing that stands out to me is the insidious nature of white supremacy. I don't know that higher ed is really prepared to be the space that cultivated leaders, collective action movements to fight back against structure, because we've become part of the problem. We've also wrote policies that are not permissive of students rising up in voice of collective action. We have student conduct policies that are fear-mongering, right? We have policies in the state that they will quickly get arrested if they do X, Y, Z. These were actions that back in the 60s when change and the civil rights movement was happening, these things were happening in the school systems.
Yes.
These things were happening by our students, right? And since then, our institutions and the nature of white supremacy culture has infiltrated and made it so that we are not the space where that can happen. Or we see them as resisting us. I will also say that what I experience over and over again in higher education, and I apologize if this offends anyone in the room, higher education in of itself is continuing to boast and educate in ways that advance white supremacy. And even though programs like the McNair Scholars Program exist and other programs that have been helping to change the face of the institution, we're not necessarily, I think, as people who make it in those spaces, always critical thinkers about the lessons that we learn and the messages that we perpetuate afterwards. We are also the people doing harm to our students of color. I've heard so many stories of students experiencing discrimination from people who they believe were on their team, right? And so we also have to analyze what we just went through.
Yes.
What messages were for us and which ones weren't, right? How higher education has now socialized us to believe that white is right, right? That money is where power is, right? Like these are the things that we get socialized in these spaces to believe, and then we're not always the best allies and advocates. We perpetuate harm. And so I guess I'll leave it with that.
I just want to hold that for a second. I just want to thank you. Professor Ferguson.
All right, no, thank you. And thank you so much for those thoughts and naming those things. It's so important that we courageously do that. To me, I think both racial and COVID pandemics both have exacerbated the experience of so many of our students, staff, and faculty across our systems and higher education at large. I think that for many folks, that feelings of social isolation, the feeling of even senses of the fear, etc., has just been so extreme in what's been going on. And in some ways, what surprised me in in that whole social milieu going on, all that tension is, there's a recognition, right, in some ways, by many, that there used to be a rhetoric of post-racial, like, oh, we've moved on, post-racial, and people are recognizing, oh my goodness, we got a problem. I actually had someone walk up to me and say, Ron, I had no idea. I had no idea. I'm so dang sorry. And it was such an awkward moment as they're coming to this sort of epiphany that, holy crap, stuff is messed up, and recognizing that. And I was surprised by this sort of, some sort of acknowledgement or tacit acknowledgement that maybe there's a problem. But some of the issues that I think that are really important with all this, and I think it speaks to what I said earlier about what it takes in community, is really recognizing what sort of allyship looks like in this work, in this season right now. And there's something, I believe this strongly, is that for us to do this work in higher education, there's no such thing as risk-free allyship in the real sense. When Bettina Love uses the phrase co-conspirator, it's like we all got something to lose. It could be our jobs, it could be our security, it could be our status, or all those kind of things that we have taken for granted. But if we're really going to step in the gap, to see these metrics on that screen and hear the lived experience of students, on whether it's what you hear here or on a panel or students in your office or classroom, we need to courageously step out and start asking questions and demanding justice. And if we're doing that, if we're speaking truth to that power, we are going to be at risk. We are going to maybe lose something, but we have to be okay with that. We have to stay the course. And for me, the idea of speaking that truth and doing it in community is something that I find as starting to bubble up. It's starting to happen. Even when it doesn't feel like that, sometimes it doesn't feel like we're moving. Skilcott Herman famously said, the revolution will not be televised. And you know what that really means for me in his poem and song of that name? Is that to me it means like this, that regardless of what you see on the screen, change is happening in our spaces. I can tell you there's student groups that are working really hard right now to create changes as we speak. They're stepping out in the front lines, risking it all. There are colleagues of mine in the state, in our system, that are speaking up and saying, what the heck is going on, as the song said. What is going on, and what are we going to do to fix it? Demanding justice, demanding change. And so, to me, the encouragement is being in this room, because being in this space rejuvenates me. I don't know about the rest of you, but when you hear like-minded folks saying, we got a problem, and we need to work collectively, do something together, we can't help but see the benefit of that and the way and the need to leverage it. See, it will not be televised because we're going to do the work anyway. Beyond what's happening in the attention of the media, we're going to do this work in the state of Minnesota. We have to. As Jeff Duncan Andrews said, we want to have a critical hope. As roses grow up in concrete, we know that our systems can be changed. You got to believe it. We cannot fall to cynicism. I'm speaking to myself. I can't say, Ron, you've been let down before. It's going to happen again. I have to believe the situation's going to change. We have to believe that. And so to me, what surprised me has been that sort of community that's developed. You've heard it here many times. That community is here in other spaces, and we are better together doing this work. And again, this is a call to action for all of us. Let's get this work done.
Thank you. Sam.
Yeah, well, I think Minerva is absolutely correct that the challenges that were kind of presented by the COVID-19 pandemic really catalyzed what's possible in terms of supporting students as whole people. All of a sudden, when we decided we were in a crisis, we were able to expand SNAP benefits. We had an eviction moratorium. We had huge sums of money for student emergency aid. And I think it just goes to show what's possible when we decide we want to support students as the full people that we are. And just because we're not in the COVID-19 pandemic anymore, we're not in that crisis, doesn't mean we're not still in a crisis. For a student that loses their housing, they are in crisis, and we need to start treating it like that. I'm glad Commissioner Olson mentioned some of the programs that the Office of Higher Education administers to support students. One particular program that I think is really great is the Emergency Assistance for Post-Secondary Students program, also called EAPS. This is a program that provides emergency grant aid to students, and actually I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Minnesota may have been the second state to have an emergency assistance program for students. And that was before the pandemic when all of that federal money came in to support that. But what we're seeing now is that federal aid has been pulled back is there's a massive need for those programs to still continue because students have emergencies whether we're in a pandemic or not. So what we heard this session loud and clear from our students, from our institutions, is that we need to continue to have this funding and support for emergency grants to students, because when we have emergency grants, we can act as interrupters to events that might cause a student to drop out or pause their studies because of an unplanned financial emergency. And so one of the really great things that I'm happy we were able to do this session is expand the funding for the emergency grants program from, I think, $400,000 to about $8.6 million, which is still not anywhere close to enough, but I think it's a start in recognizing that the crises that students are experiencing are permanent and they're always going to be there until we decide that we're going to invest enough to eradicate those. So on the flip side of the coin, thinking about how we had kind of an active response to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think where we really saw institutions falter was the response to the racial injustice pandemic. I was also a student here when George Floyd was murdered, and I remember one of the first things that happened was a demand led by Black students at this institution that the University of Minnesota cut ties with the Minneapolis Police Department. And I think it's particularly relevant today as we're waiting for the Justice Department to announce its review on whether or not MPD has a pattern and practice of violating the civil rights of people. We don't really need to wait for the conclusions of that review to know that that's the case. I think at our institutions, we can just listen to students. And at this institution in particular, students have been saying for a very long time that they don't feel safe with the Minneapolis Police Department. And so to me, I think that was an instance where this institution failed its students because it walked back on that promise, and there are still so many students that feel unsafe and meaningful change has not occurred. I think what the university did is they brought in a consultant who set up a task force which produced a report which made recommendations that the university may or may not adopt. And I think there's a lot more we can do to directly engage with students, and one of I think kind of the governance processes that sometimes frustrates me at institutions is there's this concept of shared governance, right? That we as the leaders of this institution are going to consult with, the elected faculty senate and the elected student government, and it's great to have those touch points where administrators can connect with people that represent the university community. But what about the students that aren't part of those structures of power? I think their voice is really important too, and I think if decision makers in higher education are just kind of engaging with a select group of people, they're not really getting the holistic full picture. And so I think there is a lot more work that can be done at our institutions to directly connect and actually have the onus of actually reaching out to students of color and first-generation students and Indigenous students, rather than, as Fernie kind of opened us with, doing this kind of performative engagement that doesn't really lead to meaningful solutions.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so our time is up, but I'm going to use more. Because why not? It is really important for me to give you each an opportunity to close us out with anything that you feel motivated, inspired, or that must be said in this space. So whoever wants to get us started, and don't make me voluntold you.
I can start. I'll keep starting. That's fine. 2 things. Thank you isn't big enough. for the labor that you've committed to every day, right? Just mostly that part. The other part is thinking back to, our opening around what is the purpose of higher education. It is access to citizenship, right? And it is access to democracy, and it is many other things. But I think that when we think about the socioeconomic capital that comes with a 4-year degree, it is a privilege in that particular way, right? So I leave that to say, like, there's more that we will do. It is happening. I went to NCORE, and something that was gifted to me is I am an organizer. I am that, as you are. And so if we can stay in that mindset for as long as possible and give energy to each other every day as we do it, I think that will get me through the rest of, hopefully, this part of my career. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly.
I'll just jump in and echo, first off, the one parting word I want to say is thank you. I have gratitude for so many of you in here who have made me feel like I belong, for the first generation. College student from the Virgin Islands, I had no idea what this wild ride or adventure would be, but I have so many faces and people that I know here that have made me feel like I belong, and I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. And number two is that I talked earlier about the hope that we need, and I have a hope, but a critical hope that says, not a mythical hope that says some superhero is going to come along and save the day, but a hope that says we collectively will do this work. And what it looks like is the way in which we show up in our spaces, and whether it be at a policy level or at a practice level that we're engaging in things. I think in our system, for our students that benefit right now, we have various programs. I'm so thankful that we think of bias response and the reality of the responsibility we as institutions to protect our students. What is our response to bias both on and off campus, and the bias response teams? I'm so thankful that we are disaggregating data through our equity by design methodology, that I'm working across the system, seeing schools take it seriously, that we need race-conscious inquiry, that we're recognizing these gaps cannot be tolerated. We can't just admire the problem. We have to then be informed to action. And I'm so thankful to see the groups that are participating in that work. I am thankful to see communities thinking about how we hire for equity, and seeing that we want students everywhere to see themselves in the classroom, in the office, in administration, all throughout the org chart. That these are starting to happen, and it's so many of you in here that I know doing this work that gives me the hope, because we need this to happen. You saw it up there. If we don't as a state, we're sunk. I think about me personally. What higher ed for me, when we were doing that for exercise, it was survival. There was no plan B for me. This was all I had.
Yep.
I had nothing else. If someone like, well, what happens if college doesn't work out? There was nothing else. All my eggs were in one basket. So take my individual experience. Let's take that for our system, for our system of higher education. There is no plan B. We have to succeed at this. That's a takeaway I hope we all have.
Thank you. Minerva?
Okay, so I guess I wrote down, and I've been thinking about this phrase since I watched The Handmaid's Tale, so I apologize that I'm going to quote from The Handmaid's Tale.
Good show.
Better never means better for everyone. It always means worse for some. Right? And I think about the compromise that privilege needs to make in order for equity to exist. And those of us, everyone in here who has at least educational privilege, and now I'm assuming some like middle class financial privilege, is that we have to grapple with what we're going to be willing to give up. Right? Time-wise, money-wise, collective community-wise, who we're willing to make angry. Right? Credibility, niceness. In order to advance equity. That's all.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I think just in closing, I feel really grateful. just spent the last several months hearing like every day about persistent enrollment declines in higher education, and the narrative that comes with that, of course, is that higher education isn't valuable to people, and people don't care about higher education and aren't engaged in it. And just seeing this room full of people who clearly care and who higher education means something to, and who recognize the many challenges we have right now, but also the opportunities that exist if we can make higher education more equitable, is really meaningful and really uplifting. So I'm really grateful to all of you for all of the work that you have done and continue to do to advance equity in higher education.
Thank you. Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, I think the benefit of going last is that it's already all been said. Yeah, just reiterate, I mean, a huge thank you to everyone in the room, but particularly the leadership at MNEEP, just for bringing us all together. I mean, I think MNEEP is critical, not only day-to-day policy development, but particularly during the legislative session. They show up for you, they show up with you. I mean, I'm looking at the reports sitting on the table. I remember carrying that around 10 years ago and showing it to colleagues all across the country, and they're going, what is this? Look at this, right? Look at what Minnesota has going on in terms of forming their policy. So, utilize MNEEP, utilize us at the Office of Higher Education, or really any of us here. I mean, make connections. Just thank you for everyone in the room. I mean, we're committed to dismantling, breaking down barriers, intentional, unintentional. And you have my commitment that we'll continue to do that work. I think that's pretty evident from not only the words I've shared, but everyone here on the panel. So thank you all.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, please help me thank our panelists for everything that you contributed, everything that you challenged us with, right, and everything that you so vulnerably shared. Right? I appreciate it a lot. Please help me give them another round of applause.